Barbara McClintock. In the 1940s and 1950s, while working with corn, Barbara McClintock discovered something that went against everything scientists thought they knew. Genes could move and jump around. At that time, it was widely believed that DNA was fixed, like a permanent blueprint. But McClintock showed that certain parts of the genome, which she called controlling elements, could actually jump from one location to another, turning genes on or off. These moving pieces are now known as transposons, or jumping genes. Her discovery had huge implications. It helped explain why plants sometimes have unpredictable color patterns and suggested that gene regulation, the turning on and off of genes, was a real biological mechanism. Today, we know that gene regulation is central to how cells function, how organisms develop, and even how diseases like cancer form. But when McClintock presented her findings, the scientific community didn't believe her. Many scientists simply couldn't accept the idea that a part of DNA jumped around instead of being static, so her work was dismissed as too weird to be true. Some even suggested she didn't understand her own results. Because of this reaction, McClintock stopped publishing on the topic in 1953, even though she kept researching in silence. Her ideas were largely ignored for more than a decade. Then, in the 1960s and 1970s, scientists studying bacteria, yeast, and viruses rediscovered transposons and proved that McClintock had been right all along. With new molecular tools, they could finally see what she had observed decades earlier. Suddenly, her findings made perfect sense and were recognized as a major breakthrough. Robert Goddard. Goddard, one of the fathers of modern rocketry, was one of the first ones to think that rockets could actually be used to travel to extremely high altitudes and even into space. Explained in simple terms, when a rocket forcefully pushes hot gas out from its engine, the gas pushes the rocket forward. A key part of his theory was that a rocket did not need air to push against, meaning it could work perfectly well in the vacuum of space. To prove this, he conducted experiments in a vacuum and showed that a rocket's performance actually improved without atmospheric pressure. Despite his work, Goddard was largely ignored and ridiculed. He received very little financial or public support, and many in the scientific community did not consider rocket research to be a serious or suitable pursuit for a physics professor. The press also often mocked his ideas. The most famous example came from the New York Times. In an editorial published on January 13, 1920, they wrote that he seemed to lack the knowledge given out daily in high schools because they incorrectly believed a rocket needed something to push against, like air. This public ridicule made Goddard very protective of his privacy and his work. Gradually, though, Goddard's ideas were eventually proven right, although much of the recognition came after his death in 1945. The most direct apology came from the New York Times. On July 17, 1969, the day after the Apollo 11 mission launched to the moon, the newspaper published a correction. It stated that it is now definitely established that a rocket can function in a vacuum as well as in an atmosphere. The Times regrets the error. William Harvey. Before Harvey, people believed in ideas from ancient Greek Dr. Galen, who said that the liver made blood from food and sent it to the body through the heart. Galen's ideas were over 1,500 years old, but they were still taught in medical schools across Europe. According to his theory, blood moved from one side of the heart to the other through invisible holes, and the lungs were there to cool the blood, not for breathing air. In 1628, however, Harvey published his book, De Motu Cordis, which means On the Motion of the Heart and Blood. In it, he explained how the heart works as a pump, pushing blood through arteries to the body and pulling it back through veins in a loop. He did this by carefully watching the hearts of living animals and doing experiments. For example, he showed that the liver couldn't possibly produce the huge amount of blood needed every day if Galen's theory were correct. Most doctors rejected this new idea, preferring to side with the 1,500 years old one. A doctor even said it was better to be wrong with Galen than to be right with Harvey. Because of this, Harvey lost many patients, and his reputation suffered. In his later years, he became a lot more private and avoided public debates, saying it was better to grow wise in peace than to risk another storm of criticism. It took about 20 years for his theory to be widely accepted. Louis Pasteur. Pasteur proposed that tiny living organisms called microbes were responsible for things like food going bad and people getting sick. He also believed that these microbes could be killed or weakened to stop diseases and protect people from getting them in the first place. At the time, most scientists thought fermentation, like turning grape juice into wine, happened because of chemical reactions, not because of living organisms. When Pasteur said that fermentation was actually caused by yeast, a living microbe, many experts laughed at him. French newspapers even made fun of him with cartoons showing yeast peeing into wine bottles, but Pasteur didn't back down. He kept doing experiments to prove that microbes were real and powerful. He invented a method to kill them by heating the liquids, a process that became known as pasteurization from his surname. He also disproved a common belief that life could appear from non-living things, called spontaneous generation, by showing that germs came from the air, not from nowhere. Some scientists accused him of doing bad science, or even outright lying. But since Pasteur's results kept proving correct, over time, more people accepted his germ theory of disease. This led to huge changes in medicine, like sterilizing surgical tools and hands, and creating vaccines to prevent deadly infections. He created vaccines for anthrax and rabies, and even saved the French silk industry by stopping a disease in silkworms. Although some of his methods were criticized later, and he didn't always give credit to others, his discoveries had a huge impact on medicine. Marcello Malpighi. Marcello Malpighi, the Italian scientist from the 1600s who is now known as the father of microscopic anatomy, studied at the University of Bologna. But since he wasn't born in Bologna, the university authorities really disliked him. This bias followed him throughout his life and would eventually lead to serious consequences. Using microscopes, Malpighi made many discoveries that changed science forever. For example, he was the first to see how small arteries connect to small veins through capillaries, confirming a key part of how blood flows in the body. He also observed red blood cells, studied the lungs and brain, discovered taste buds, and showed that insects breathe through holes in their skin, not lungs. However, despite his discoveries, Malpighi was treated with hostility in Bologna. His work was welcomed in other parts of Italy and in places like the Royal Society of London, which made him a member. But in Bologna, he was ridiculed and isolated by fellow scientists, so much so that the situation escalated to violence. His house was attacked and burned. His microscopes were smashed, and his papers and books were destroyed. Even so, Malpighi kept working. He held teaching positions across Italy, was invited to be the papal physician in Rome, and had his complete scientific works published by the Royal Society after his death. Robert Hanbury-Brown. Robert Hanbury-Brown, along with his collaborator Richard Twiss, introduced an idea in the 1950s that completely changed how scientists understood light. They proposed that you could measure the size of distant stars by observing how pairs of photons, which are the particles of light, interfered with each other. This concept, known as the Hanbury-Brown and Twiss effect, suggested that two photons, even though they are supposed to be independent particles, could show a kind of statistical correlation when measured correctly. Their idea directly contradicted the established thinking of the time, and one of the most famous physicists of the 20th century, Paul Dirac, flat out rejected the theory, saying that two photons couldn't possibly interfere with each other. Many others in the physics community agreed and considered the theory to be nonsense. In response to the criticism, Hanbury-Brown wrote 3 detailed papers explaining exactly how the effect worked and how to observe it using the technology available in the 1950s. Instead of waiting for acceptance, he and Twiss went ahead and built their own radio telescope system to test the idea. Using this system, they were able to measure the diameters of many of the stars bright enough to be observed from Earth, confirming that their method worked in practice. Still, the scientific community wasn't convinced. Critics argued that if the effect was real, it should also show up in laboratory tests using artificial light sources. Several labs tried to reproduce the results and failed. Hanbury-Brown didn't give up. He repeated the experiment himself, this time using visible light under controlled lab conditions. He did it properly, and the effect appeared just as predicted. This final proof silenced the doubts. Over time, the technique they developed became one of the most widely used tools in optics, astronomy, and nuclear physics. Despite all of this, Hanbury-Brown never received the Nobel Prize. Ludwig Boltzmann. Back in the 1800s, people didn't understand how heat and energy behaved because they didn't yet know the laws of thermodynamics or the existence of atoms and molecules. They did have an hypothesis for molecules, but they had no real evidence yet. Boltzmann, however, basing his theory on the existence of them, came up with a new formula, the one you're seeing on screen right now. This formula is about entropy, which is the amount of disorder or randomness in a system, helping to show why things naturally move from order to disorder. Important scientists at the time, including figures like Ernst Mach and Wilhelm Ostwald, rejected Boltzmann's work, arguing that physical theories should only be based on observable phenomena, not invisible and unprovable particles. Some academic journals wouldn't even let him use the word atom without calling it a useful fiction. This intense opposition led Boltzmann into battles with other scientists, and he never stopped defending his idea until 1906, when he killed himself. Just a few years after his death, Einstein's and Jean Perrin's works provided definitive proof of the existence of atoms and molecules, confirming Boltzmann's ideas. Today, they are a cornerstone of physics, chemistry, and even biology. It's thanks to his ideas if we understand lots of things, from how gases behave to how modern computers process information. Unfortunately, Boltzmann will never know how impactful his ideas were. His entropy formula is engraved on his tombstone in Vienna. Sir James Young Simpson. In the 1800s, surgery and childbirth were incredibly painful because there was no effective way to relieve pain, like anesthesia. Simpson was disturbed by the suffering he saw and became determined to find a way to make those procedures less agonizing. He began experimenting with chemicals and, in 1847, discovered that chloroform could safely put people to sleep. He tested it on himself and his assistants, then began using it during childbirth. His idea was revolutionary, but unfortunately, it was also controversial. Many Christian fundamentalists and religious authorities believed that women were supposed to experience pain during childbirth as part of divine punishment, and that using anesthesia was against God's will. Simpson was heavily criticized, not only by religious leaders, but also by medics who were skeptical and concerned about the safety of chloroform. Despite this backlash, Simpson continued using it, confident that he was helping patients. A major turning point came in 1853, when Queen Victoria used chloroform during the birth of her 8th child, Prince Leopold. The fact that the Queen herself had chosen to use it silenced many critics and helped make the practice widely accepted across Britain. Simpson didn't stop there. He improved tools used in childbirth, advocated for the use of midwives in hospitals, and pushed for better conditions in medical care. In 1866, he became the first person to be knighted for services to medicine, Georges Lemaître. Lemaître wasn't satisfied with the common belief at the time that the universe had always existed and was static. He actually believed it was expanding. He used Einstein's general theory of relativity to support his theory, and was the first to link the movement of galaxies, which are moving away from us, to this expansion. In 1927, he even estimated a value for the rate of this expansion, what we now call the Hubble constant. Then, a few years later, in 1931, he introduced the idea that the universe started from a single point, which he called the primeval atom. This would later become known as the Big Bang Theory. At the time, Lemaître's ideas were either just ignored or mocked by many in the scientific community. A big reason for this was that he was a Catholic priest, and some thought his ideas were just a way to support his religious beliefs, especially the concept of a creation. Even Einstein dismissed his early work, saying that while Lemaître's math was correct, his physics was abominable. However, in 1929, Edwin Hubble published new data showing that galaxies were indeed moving away from each other, which matched what Lemaître had predicted 2 years earlier. Over time, scientists realized that Lemaître had been right all along, and by the 1960s, the discovery of cosmic microwave background radiation provided strong evidence for the Big Bang Theory. Fortunately, just before he died in 1966, Lemaître learned of this discovery. Just recently, in 2018 to be exact, the scientific community officially recognized his contributions by renaming Hubble's law to the Hubble-Lemaître law. If you liked this video, subscribe for similar ones or join my Discord to suggest another.